probably of all the industries, social media probably has more value within healthcare, in the sense that a lot of healthcare is really based on information. Health and healthcare are inherently social propositions, and the problem in healthcare with social media, and also the thing that makes it fascinating and interesting, are kind of the challenges involved from an industry perspective. And it involves a lot in order for the industry to really understand social media beyond just understanding how the tools work, and that's the easy part, is understanding how consumers use these tools in their own ways at different times in their life. So there's no standard boilerplate approach to this from a provider perspective. It really depends on what kind of community is tied into that provider. Is it disease specific? Is it public health? And then the other part of this is that social media is almost so amorphous that it lends itself to a whole bunch of purposes. There's all sorts of different ways you can use it. You can think about it in terms of buckets. You can see social media as a way to provide customer service. You can see it as a way to disseminate and generate specific or ambient content. You can use it as a way to expand your presence in search. You can use it as public relations, you can use it in marketing, and you could use it in sales. So if you think about a spectrum from general content to sales, those are sort of the ends of the spectrum, right? And then everything in between. The challenge in healthcare and in any industry, if you were to look at the y-axis, and the y-axis being the level of difficulty, as you go from sort of general just content publication to the ultimate, which is sales, the level of difficulty just goes up. And something like sales, something like if your business objective is to generate more revenues and more referrals, that's like the most difficult thing to do. And it's not only difficult, it's rather dangerous, because if you're doing all of these other things, the sales, if your presence is really a salesy presence, it just collapses the whole thing. Right. So to do it right, it's sort of an inversion of how things used to be, that you kind of just sort of stay away from sales and just use that. You have to decide what you're trying to achieve, and there's different things for different providers. Some providers are interested in, I just want to market myself, and other providers are, well, yes, I'd like to get referrals, but I'm okay with maybe just getting some. Maybe that's a side effect. What I'm really interested in is showing the world my expertise, or the expertise of our facility, sharing stories, sharing patient stories, or being part of a professional network, expanding my knowledge base by connecting to people who are in my specialty, or getting news, or being part of the conversation. So there's no, I get asked that question all the time. There's no like one sentence. It's not something you can sum up in 140 characters. It really is dependent upon what you're trying to achieve.
Now, thank you, Phil. Now, this is Dan and Don from the Clinical Trials Guru, and we've got Phil Bauman on. And Phil, you run healthissocial.com, amongst other things. And we're also going to get into what you do with the Mayo Clinic a little bit later. Tell us a little bit about Health is Social.
So Health is Social is a service that I provide to help organizations, individuals, as well as the general public in understanding not so much social media, although that plays a big part. It's, everybody needs to kind of get up to speed. It really is about kind of putting things into perspective across the whole spectrum of healthcare. So on the business end, it's basically essentially a consulting service. There's a lot of speaking engagements, workshops, private meetings. But on the sort of passion, play, the desire to kind of be involved in the public conversation. The essential brand, if you will, of Health is Social is to talk about anything related to health. Mm-hmm. Where health is social kind of explains it in this sense that social, I define social in two respects. One is social in terms of you and I having a conversation, but then there's sort of non-animate social. And to me, health is a social proposition, as I said earlier. And that, you know, from the molecular basis of life to building cells, which build organs, which build systems, which build animals, which become things like us, which create things like Twitter and Facebook, the entire thing is social. So even though I think a lot of people see it as a social media healthcare site, which it is, I guess the uniqueness of what I try to do is I try to be more holistic and try to say, yeah, you know, the social stuff, okay, we get it, it's out there, it's 2012, and we'll talk about social media because there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to talk about with respect to boundaries, informed consent, privacy, dignity. There's an endless thing. We can certainly talk more about that beyond just marketing. But then there's just the whole idea that we're now at a point where maybe we need to rethink healthcare or even unthink our assumptions. So Health is Social has a little bit of there's a little bit of snark, there's a little bit of questioning, there's a little bit of, hey, have you thought about things from this angle? And so that's what I try to do on the public facing side of Health is Social.
What do you think, Don?
I think this is quite interesting. What keeps ringing in my mind is actually how this can play in the doctor-patient relationship. Can you expand on that?
Sure. The physician-patient relationship, let's take a step back from social real quick, and then we'll come back to social.
Okay.
To social media. Ultimately, the patient-provider relationship is really essential, and that too, it's a very social. Again, it's a social relationship. We are now getting to the point, however, where the relationship, statistically at least, patients are getting less and less connection with their physicians, and physicians are getting less and less connection with their patients. And so we're seeing the emergence of sort of new schools of thought, like participatory medicine. I usually don't care for buzzwords like, you know, in general, but participatory medicine is a great term because participatory medicine brings up almost all of these issues to begin with. So that how do patients and providers come together to solve a common problem? Because it's complex. A physician brings expertise and experience from their medical perspective. The consumer brings their expertise from their personal knowledge of their own life, and there's an interesting meeting ground there. And I think right now medicine and medical schools need to return to this, and in some are, because over the last 30 or 40 years, medicine has sort of moved away from a participatory model, and I think now the desire is to go back there. So where social media fits in, it's similar. It's like, okay, so how can a physician and a patient have a relationship online? That's an incredibly important decision, and not everything that happens in a face-to-face transaction can or necessarily should happen in social media. It doesn't necessarily port well. I don't believe that the online world is exactly a mirror of the offline world. There are little subtle twists. So that's why I think we need to have these conversations, and we probably have to have some research because it's very easy to violate boundaries online. It's much easier to violate a patient's boundaries on Twitter or Facebook. I mean, very simple question. Should you friend your physician, should you friend a patient on Facebook? Now, some physicians, there are physicians who are very liberal in this respect, will say, it's really no different. It's no different than, you know, meeting them on the street. It's all cool. There's really not much to do as long as you don't compromise safety, as information. But I would argue, and then there are those who are extremely conservative, who don't want anything to do with this. And I would argue that there's a middle ground, and the difficulty is that you're dealing with media. You're working through a medium. And if you don't understand the medium, if you don't understand how things can be misinterpreted through the medium, if you don't know how this person on the other end, from 100 miles away or 1,000 miles away or even next door, if you really aren't able to kind of see the reaction, this requires a new kind of therapeutic communication, and it requires a new way for physicians to understand communication. So I think what it means for the patient-provider side, on the provider side, is physicians are going to have to learn how to communicate here if they wish to enter this domain.
Now, for those of you who don't know Phil, he also sits on the Mayo Clinic's Board of Advisors. Is that correct, Phil?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I would imagine a lot of your conversations there revolve around these kind of topics. So,
right.
I know the Mayo Clinic, because our audience mostly is either clinical trial professionals or people who are interested in clinical trials in one way or another. They're involved in a lot of clinical trials. Is there any talk of how they're using social media or how they're thinking of using social media as far as clinical trials are concerned?
Right. So the Mayo Clinic's main focus really has predominantly been on hospitals and healthcare facilities, more on the healthcare industry as opposed to the biomed pharma industry. You know, these types of topics come up, but they're not something that really has been tackled. They are different industries, for good or ill, and pharma is very interesting because it has the same challenges and opportunities that healthcare has, with more layers of other problems, specifically the FDA and other regulatory bodies throughout the world. So it's a different animal. I don't know if the Mayo Clinic has plans to go beyond that. I mean, they're a hospital themselves, so that's their area of expertise. And at this point, that's really the focus. However, from my perspective, and we haven't seen much yet, and I've sort of stepped away from pharma in the last year or two, but one thing that I am interested in, and it's an interest that's sort of been ignited in the last few months, does have to do with the IRB process. If you think about social media, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity there, right? Mm-hmm. But there's also a tremendous amount of danger, ethical danger. And, so what are the protocols? How do you, maybe it may even get to the point where the very presence of these media actually may call into question or maybe trigger a whole rethink of the IRB process. I don't know. It's just a thought, because now you've got all this fantastic data. I mean, there's data out there that in a way is potentially life-saving data, in the sense that it could be data that can be gathered, collated, interpreted, could ultimately help not only drive the ideation and the production of new chemicals or devices, but it could just add to our existing medical knowledge, and not just medical knowledge, but an understanding of what patients are doing about their own disease processes and what kind of communities. I mean, it's probably an infinite combination of data now that we have that with social that we didn't have before. Plus, more and more people are more public about it. So, I don't think it's enough to just say, well, we'll just make the data anonymous. I think that there are some real heavy-duty ethical issues there that need to be explored. So I don't know. I have an interest in it now, but unfortunately I haven't had time to really see what kind of case studies are out there or who's really developing those policies.
Well, let's expand on that, because for those of you who don't know Phil, he's got a YouTube channel. What's the channel's name, Phil?
It's Phil Bauman on YouTube.
Phil Bauman, just like his name. We'll have the links on the blog. He talks a lot of his videos focus on the future and like how things could be thanks to technology. Can you just give us an example scenario of, let's say, how an IRB of the future would be? I think it would be interesting to just kind of play around with that idea.
Well, that's a good question, and you have a lot more expertise in the clinical process. Maybe you and I can actually think of something real quick about that, because I think one of the things we're going to have to consider is informed consent. There's a question: how do you get informed consent? For instance, you're a researcher, you're gathering data, and you find. See, the thing is, in social media, if I am talking about asthma, or I'm talking with other people about whatever, diabetes or whatever, I may be into the quantified self movement, for whatever, and I may be using applications to do this.
The whole e-patient movement, right?
Right. But the interesting thing is, even though technically I know that this stuff is public, I wasn't really given informed consent by a specific researcher to collect that data, right? And so then it becomes an interesting situation. If you're collecting this data, it's different than, say, previous kinds of data collection, where you may have been collecting data, but they weren't necessary. You really couldn't necessarily tie it to an individual, or much harder. But now it's right there. The data is the individual. The individual is the data. If it's in a tweet, it's right there. Even if they're using a different username. On top of that, it's very easy to just extract from a Twitter handle or a Facebook and extract their whole social graph. And then that's even more data. So I just throw this out as an off-the-cuff thing to consider, that if you're going to be doing that, IRBs are going to have to consider, oh gosh, what are the, pardon me, I'm sorry, what are the protocols here? How far do we go? Do we collect just this information?
Right.
What's going to happen if this happens? What happens if a patient starts communicating with research, or finds out or discovers? What effect does being observed have on online behavior? If I know I'm being tracked, does that then affect the data I'm putting? So
yeah, and those are some of the issues that we are running into, because some of the studies currently are starting to use these new online things. For instance, one study wants you to actually film one of the rating scales, and then you plug that into the computer and you send that information to them. You're right. The question is how comfortable is that subject going to be sitting in front of that camera, knowing that they're being filmed, especially if you're dealing with people who, by the nature of their illness, is paranoid,
right,
anxiety, and these type of symptoms that are arising because of their the nature of their illness. How is it going to affect the whole outcome?
Right. Those are excellent questions, especially in behavioral health. That's a really good example. I don't have the answers. I mean, I think the answers aren't going to come from an individual. I think the answers, first of all, there's not one question. There's a whole series of questions, and then the questions probably open doors to new questions. So I think we're going to need panels. I think we're going to have to bring in people who have expertise here. But then I also think we're going to need people who might not have the expertise and the experience necessarily in necessarily clinical trial or IRB, but people who have a general understanding of these problems and are willing to, in association maybe with academic institutions, as well as private research, to really tackle this. Because I don't know if overall a lot of our boards are really plugged into this. I mean, I don't even know how many are actually even considering social media and other digital media.
No, they're definitely way behind. We gotta definitely do a part 2, because I know we're running out of time here, Phil. Yep. We'll definitely do a part 2 to this interview. I wanted to thank the producers of our show before we leave. The first 100 people who get a profile on the Clinical Trials Guru also get to be producers, so we thank Sarah Siegler, Resolve Research Solutions, Accurate Clinical Trials, PTNR, and Erdhart Clinical Trials, and also give a thanks to Dr. Celso Arabetti from Argentina, who's a fan of the show, and he says hi to you, Phil.
Hello back.
So yeah, interesting stuff, and for those of you who want to follow Phil, what's the Twitter handle?
It's Phil Baumann, PhilBaumann. I'm also Health is Social on Twitter, and then my 2 other accounts are RN chat and MD chat, and MD chat has an underscore between MD and chat. And those are Twitter chats for physicians and nurses.
Yeah, see, we didn't even get into that. We'll get into those next time because it's
We'll do it next time.
how clinicians can communicate online with other clinicians and how it's changing the game. So thank you, Phil.
That's definitely
We know you got to run, and we appreciate your time.
Next time. All right. Enjoy your day.
Phil.
Thank you.
Pleasure
Thank
talking to you.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.